Vicki, I'm so delighted that you could join me today in this beautiful morning here on Willows Beach. I'd like to start by asking you to describe your role at UVic and touch on some of your research as well, if you wish.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I wanted to start by showing my gratitude to the Lekwungen people on whose land we're talking right now and on whose land I've been coming my whole life. The reason I suggested meeting at Willows is because my grandparents lived in Victoria when I was growing up. I was on the East Coast near Washington, D.C. Every summer we'd come out here to visit them and spend time. So Willows was my beach. And my grandparents were originally from England, so they were settlers here, and I'm a settler here. And I think that carries a lot of responsibility and something that the university can play a large role in embracing as we move towards Indigenous resurgence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So my work at the university, and I'm in the Art History and Visual Studies department. I've been here since 1989 and seen a lot of changes and seen a lot of continuity. My area is looking at Indigenous art history with a focus on responses to colonialism, creative ways that people retained their cultures, retained their values despite the tremendous oppression that they faced and which still continues today in many ways.
Yes.
So I look at older arts. I have a large focus on current events, contemporary arts, why knowing about the arts is relevant to everyone today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm also interested in the role of the internet in affecting the way that people walk around in the world and think about information. It's not as unrelated to the Indigenous art history as it may sound, because in Indigenous ways of knowing, everything connects. Ecosystems, obviously, they're dynamic systems. They're driven by complexity, diversity, the relationships between all the components, the process as changes take place and ripple through the whole system. And that is the way the world operates. So everything connects. And in the internet, it itself is this system. Everything connects on it. It's very relational. And as people navigate, they are freed from this very linear process that one has when one reads. They're freed from being the passive audience, being led by the author, the authority, who makes all the decisions about where to go. And instead has this interactive process where one is always aware of links, relationships. One navigates in nonlinear ways, and as the user, one chooses to some extent how to be engaging with the information, where to go. So we have a generation growing up now, regardless of their cultural background, who have, from a very early age, been engaging with knowledge in a nonlinear way and in a very participatory way and in a way that celebrates relationships. And I think that's really significant. It's possibly going to cause a shift in the way that we approach problem solving, and it's a shift that we have to have if we're going to deal with complex systemic problems like climate change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And in thinking about these concepts of nonlinear time, relationships, ecosystems, would you have thoughts to share about the life stages, life stories, family, nuclear families versus intergenerational families? How might these concepts of nonlinear time help us think about our own life stories?
Yeah. Well, I think the idea of thinking in terms of systems and relationships, I call it ecosystems thinking, that pervades everything. It relates to everything. And right now, in a Western colonial context, many of us have grown up being taught a very different way of operating. So one of the examples of that from an illustration is the organizational chart of University of Victoria, actually, which as you can see, I got this off their website some time ago. And as you can see, it's laid out with boxes, very discrete boxes separated from each other, each one a category, and in hierarchical arrangements.
Absolutely.
So that you have these layers of authority. Everything is very separate, discrete from everything else. And that's the way that government operates. You have these individual departments, sometimes to the extent that a different department will be dealing with oceans than is dealing with land, even though salmon go on both.
Yeah.
There's this idea of separation and categorization, taxonomy.
Yeah.
And I even Googled organizational chart yesterday because I was curious to see what would come up. And in this result, a screenshot of the results, page after page after page of this type of very boxy categories, separate from each other in linear hierarchical relationships, and even at the top they invite me to see the same thing related to businesses, related to schools, we just saw one of those, related to office, restaurants, construction, and hospital, manufacturing, and I didn't click on that arrow to see what else they offered me, but that gives you a sense of how pervasive this way of thinking is.
Oh, absolutely.
And that relates to views of time, where if one is thinking in terms of these separate boxes, the past is far behind us and getting farther every day. And the present is here, the future is somewhere out there. A very different way of organizing the world is shown in this chart, which is off of the Alaska Native Knowledge Network's website. It's a spiral chart for integrated learning. It happens to be suggesting how one might conceive of a curriculum. It reflects a whole way of thinking, which is so different from the boxes we've been looking at. Instead of boxes, we have everything spiraling together with everything else. So here are various themes that this course might think about, everything spiraling together.
Yes.
And instead of a hierarchy, you have everything at any moment relating to all the others, which is how the world actually functions.
Yes.
Ecosystems are always a system. You can't separate each component out into these. Yes. So this is really reflecting the way the world works.
That family.
Absolutely.
Right there.
Absolutely right there. So you ask about views of time. I thought I'd show the contrast between this way of conceiving of the world and this way of conceiving of the world visually. Yes, visually sometimes these contrasts really come through. This is one reason why visual studies is so important.
Yes. That was one of my questions.
Yes.
Too, the power of the visual.
Oh, the power of the visual.
Yes.
Yeah. So right there you can see immediately the conceptual difference. Views of time. Well, first I'll say that this way of thinking, the categories and the hierarchies, has been around for a very long time. Here's a drawing of the Great Chain of Being concept. This one is 1579, and it is showing an arrangement of categories of species going from lowest to highest, human beings at the highest, and being very close to divinity, encouraging people to be thinking in this very linear, hierarchical, categorized way, which is very similar to what we have today in 2019, our organizational charts. And it relates to time. So the way that this encourages us to think about time is very linear. The past receding, getting farther and farther and farther behind us, and the present, and then the future way ahead of us, which is, if you just flip it on its side, very much the same conceptually as the medieval Great Chain of Being and the contemporary organizational chart. It's entirely embedded in the same way of conceiving the world, which is not the way reality actually operates, which is everything connects. Instead, it's a tool to understand the world. We forget that it's a tool and we think it's reality. So a different way of conceptualizing time, and one which I think is absolutely essential for addressing problems like climate change, is this, where at any moment the past is present and the future is present.
That's beautiful.
And you ask about family relationships. Well, this is important because we need to be understanding how the past forms the present in order to be getting at roots of issues, and we always have to be thinking about a long-term future if we're going to be addressing problems. When we are on this very linear timeline, the past becomes less and less relevant because it is so far behind us. It's not in the present. And the future is so far ahead of us. And we tend to be thinking in terms of 5-year budgetary cycles, sometimes 3 years.
And
instead
I
of
feel it's also an anxiety-inducing model.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is a huge issue right now.
It's a huge issue
with families.
It is. Yeah.
Intergenerational relationships.
Yeah. And so, how does it relate to ideas of family? And I'm drawing on indigenous ways of knowing, but I want to emphasize that first, being a settler myself, I can't be speaking for indigenous people, but secondly, that many cultures in the world have different ways of viewing the world than this organizational chart system. We tend to often think of that as somehow the default. It's not. And so in showing these sorts of models, I am really celebrating a whole range of cultures and ways of viewing the world which view it more realistically than this very categorized, linear, hierarchical arrangement that I grew up with and so many settlers did.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and in a construct like this, ancestors are very present in the present. And you ask about those relationships with family. If ancestors are present in the present, then that means a view of time where the past is not receding, the past is not irrelevant. It's very much part of contemporary lived experience. And to the extent that the past is part of contemporary experience, the future becomes very relevant too. If we are with our ancestors now, we also are ancestors to people in the future.
Yeah.
It encourages a way of thinking about the future and caring about the future in a way which is very different from the linear timeline, where the future is off there and where the past is down there. And by the same token, it encourages respect between generations, so that somebody who is old, however one wants to define that, I define it later and later as time goes on, but someone who is old carries this knowledge of lived experience with them into the present, and that's very important, rather than carrying the knowledge of a time when, for instance, the internet didn't exist, so in what way is their experience at all relevant to us? It's a very different way of viewing the family members and generations. It also encourages a way of relating between generations, which is very different from a society that categorizes people by age. If you look at the school system, you're grouped by how old you are, not by your experiences, your aptitudes, your interests, but how old you are. And that type of grouping continues on pretty much throughout life.
Oh, absolutely.
Based on that type of categorizing, linear, hierarchical, you hear parents so often talking about how big you are. You know, and the goal of the child is to become older and older and older until you get to be middle-aged, at which point the goal is to stay younger and younger and younger. But at any rate, the goal is there are value systems along that linear line.
Oh, absolutely.
In a way that a model like this does. And that translates into how families relate to different generations.
Absolutely. And I feel for our youth in particular, that there's a sense of urgency that somehow they have to be meeting the future expectations, and that the past really doesn't matter.
That's right.
And the present is only there to facilitate their entry into the future.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And it does cut them off from family, from the wisdom of parents and elders.
Yep. Absolutely.
We started with our relationships to the land. And I wondered if you had anything more to add as we sit here in this beautiful morning on Willows Beach.
Yes, I think, as I mentioned, this way that we view the world, whether we view it in these boxes or whether we view it as terms of invisible relationships, everything connecting as actually the world is in ecosystems, that relates to our relationship with nature too. More and more people are living their lives indoors. Normally we'd be filming indoors. People are living their lives indoors and going out into nature as a diversion from their daily routine. And that's another form of categorization. It also relates to an attitude towards nature, which is that it's not something which is part of our lives, but rather something that human beings dominate, extraction type of approach
and
to
that
it.
great chain of being is absolutely
Precisely, it underpins it, so that human beings are a part away from the system rather than part of that system. And our daily experience often mirrors that, how little time we have to spend outdoors, how much it is something we do as a break from our regular routine. And it also affects relationship with animals, and the great chain of being too has this whole your relationship is somehow qualitatively different from everything that is not human. And this has major implications on policy decisions, on the way that we approach issues like climate change and the way that we approach sustainability. One thing that I try to do every day is to be outdoors with my dog. That's a relationship with an animal, and seeing the way that he explores the outdoors, which is different from the way I do. It gives me a different way of seeing things. I really think that's important for people to maintain these relationships with other species in ways which are respecting them for who they are, rather than a human being somehow hierarchically above.
Absolutely.
So that returns to the sense that that paradigm that we approach our world with affects everything and every relationship.
Okay, thank you again, Vicki. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have your thoughts and perceptions about the nature of time and how it so affects everything we do, and the focus on relationships, so key to our life stories. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me here today on beautiful Willows Beach.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm really excited to see the exhibit. I appreciate an exhibit which is honoring all the stages of life and asking us to think about them together.
Yeah, thank you so much.